Hi, Jackie. How are you today?
Oh, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Good.
Doing
What's up
great.
for today?
Yeah, so I was thinking about what we could talk about today, and I thought we could talk about one of my all-time favorite foods to grow.
Ooh,
Um,
which is?
this is onions, and
Ooh.
it's not really something that sounds like interesting to a lot of people. They're like, "Why are we talking about onions?" But it's actually a really fascinating plant to grow, and I'd like to talk about our experiences with it and maybe just
Love it.
share a couple things with it. So,
Love it. Let's do it.
oddly enough, onions are not one of my favorite foods to eat.
Yes,
Um,
true.
I have some digestive upset, and onions are not one of my happy foods to eat.
Right.
So, I don't eat them very often, but I do love to grow them. I sell a lot of onions in my Etsy shop and things like that. So I do love to grow them. My family likes to eat them, specifically my husband. And I remember our mom would like cook with onions a lot growing up.
Yeah.
So that was
Yeah.
a strong memory from childhood. But
Yes.
um,
So tell me why is it that you love to grow onions so much, especially if you don't like to eat them because of,
right.
health reasons.
Well, one of the
What's
main reasons that I like to grow them is because there's a lot of different types, and I don't think a lot of people know that. And I just think they're fun. Like they're beautiful plant and they
Agreed.
grow well. Like they're really easy to grow in the wintertime and to like anyway, I can just grow them practically year round, really. And
Really?
I think it's really intriguing to grow those year round. And
Mm.
then I have some really specialty ones that I sell. So I think that's why I like growing them.
Oh, cool, cool, cool. Okay, so you talk about growing them in the winter because okay, let's be real. Most people probably only know red onions, yellow onions, and white onions.
Right. Because when you go to the store, that's what they have. They have the
That's
colored variety. And
right.
usually most people are familiar with that. That's what we call a bulb onion. So ones that have grown a bulb. And that's what we cook with most of the time. You cut that bulb up and you cook with it, right?
Right.
In your soup or
Correct.
whatever.
Right. But you talk about growing onions in the winter.
Mhm.
So we did another video or episode about winter gardening, which is really just like kind of like preserving your food when it's really super cold. Is that the same process that you do with onions, or do they actually grow in the winter?
Um, some do. So winter gardening, yeah, is protecting your plants from the weather so that they can grow or
Right,
be protected outside and like kind of preserved in the garden.
right.
I have a patch of green onions that I've grown that have they just overwinter with no protection year after year,
Wow,
and I think that's really cool.
that is cool.
So they're called evergreen white bunching onions,
Cool.
and I usually have them for sale. So if you're looking for an overwintering green onion, that's the one to get. They are so you told me that you use like green onions from the store. Maybe you can talk about that. But these green onions, this patch of green onions, I don't buy green onions at the store anymore because I almost always have green onions growing, other
Exactly.
than about a month that they go dormant in the winter and then they grow right back.
Right.
So if I need green onions in the wintertime, usually I have stored onions at that point that I can use. Anyway, I just feel like onions are one of those things that I have all the time.
I love that. I
So,
love that. Yeah. Yeah. And really, the only contribution I have to this whole conversation is like two things, right? It's like, um, I think you had taught me the whole green onion thing, and this was really the first food that I've been like self-sufficient in. So once I started, so I just bought a bunch of green onions from the grocery store, which are right, they're also called scallions.
right.
So if like you're confused about what we're actually like clearly talking about, they're scallions or green onions. They come in those little bunches, um, which are not the same as chives. Chives are different. So those are the tiny little skinny green
Right.
onions. Anyway, so I bought a bunch of green onions at the store, chopped them up down to the white root area, and then I took like I mean I only had like an inch left of the plant with the root and the white part, and I took those 4 or 5 or 6 roots, and I went and put them in my garden bed, and I just let them grow, and I watered them, and then I bought more green onions at the store and did the same thing, just added to the little section. And I ended up having like, I don't know, 15 or so green onions there. And that was, I think, a year and a half ago when I did that. And like now you can talk about this later, right? But like some of them are now on their second year and they are full on seeding. But there's other ones that are like just growing like normal. And so I'm like, it's just so lovely to know that I always have green onions outside. It's really the first food that I've been like totally self-sufficient in, and it's a good feeling. So that's the first thing that I can contribute. And the only other thing that I have to add to this conversation is I was at a neighbor's just a month and a half ago, roughly, and they have this huge garden in their backyard. And they were like, come and harvest whatever you want. And I was like, are you kidding me? And they're like, yeah, it's free for all. I'm like, okay. So I went to their backyard, and they had these beautiful onions. I think they're yellow onions just ready to harvest. And it was the first time I've tried growing onions in the past. I haven't quite figured that out yet. And I just popped them out of the ground. They're, as we know, in the allium family, which is the garlic and onions and things, like when they're ready to harvest, the green part that's growing up above starts kind of bending over. And so their greens were like bending over. And I'm like, oh, I know that they're ready to harvest because of that. So I popped like 10 or 15 or so out of the ground and took them home with me. And it's just been such a lovely process for the last month and a half to be like, I didn't grow these onions, but I know where they come from. And again, like carbon cycle was shorter with those onions. That's just a really happy thing for me. So I'll let you share all the other.
A lot of people don't know that you can take green onions from the store and regrow them from the roots. Yeah. So that's a really cool way to use some food scraps and regrow some food. So that's awesome. You can also just stick them in some water.
Yes.
And they'll just grow tops again. So
yep. In your fridge or on your countertop. Yep.
Awesome. Yeah. So that's cool that you harvested some full grown onions too.
So fun. So fun.
Yeah. So one thing you're going to want to know about onions if you're growing them yourself is there's typically three growing types that you're going to see. So they're called long day, midday, and short day.
Okay.
And onions are very sensitive to day length. And so if you plant the wrong type, they're not going to create a bulb.
Okay.
So basically the way I think about it is if you take a map of the United States, Jackie and I live in Utah and Idaho, northern Utah and Idaho. So if you take a map of the United States and you cut it lengthwise into thirds,
okay,
that's going to be your day length.
Okay.
Sections. So the lower third, which is going to be like Southern California, Arizona, Florida, Texas, those states, those are going to be the ones that grow the short day onions.
Interesting. You would think it's the opposite.
You would think it's the opposite. The reason why is because the way the earth is tilted, if you think about it, like their day length doesn't change as much as northern climates do.
Oh.
Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So northern climates have longer days in the summer than the ones closer to the equator. They have slightly shorter days, just the way the earth tilts, right?
Yep.
That makes sense. The ones in the middle, so like Nevada, Oklahoma, mid-California, things like that, right? All of those middle states are going to grow the midday onions. And then where we live, northern Utah, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, those ones, they're going to grow ones that are called long day onions.
Okay.
Because our day length is slightly longer. And if you notice, like from the top of the United States to the bottom of the United States, it's not really that different in day length, but it matters to an onion.
Okay. Which is an interesting point, right? Like you got to get to know your plants, right? And what they love and what they don't love. Because blueberries I've learned that blueberries love really acidic soil.
Right.
unless you have really specific acidic soil, they're not going to grow very well.
Right.
It's like you have to get to know your plants and figure out
Mhm.
what their specific preferences are. So that's a
Right.
cool point.
Now, having said that, I haven't tried growing short date onions here.
Okay,
So that might be an experiment to try and just see if they work out.
sure.
I would guess you're probably just going to get green onions out of them and
Oh,
no
okay.
bulbs. But
Okay.
again, I haven't tried it. So I usually stick to the long day varieties.
Okay.
That's pretty much what I grow, and they work really well. So the cool thing about onions is they're one of the very first plants that you can start from seeds. Like
Oh,
literally, you can start them January 15th indoors, and you can transplant them out pretty
cool.
early.
I've seen that. I've seen a video by the MI gardener guy
Mhm.
on YouTube, and that's what he does.
You
He
can,
just grows them inside and then transplants them outside, which we know some plants don't do well transplanting. So it's cool
yeah,
that
but
you
onions do really well with transplanting.
do.
The MI gardener, he lives in Michigan, so that's a northern state as well. So you anything he grows, you could grow where we live as well.
Cool.
Yeah, so exactly. So you can start them in January and you can really just take a pot or a tray or anything and just put out seeds. And they're going to grow. They actually grow interesting. They grow really tall, like
Mhm.
probably an inch or two, and they fold over. So they push out of the ground with this like this folded over portion of itself.
Mhm.
And then once it gets tall enough, it's going to pop out of the ground and the seed is like still stuck to the end of it.
Oh,
So they're kind of interesting. They like unfold and it still has that little green, that little black seed attached. And then eventually that black seed falls off and then it keeps growing up. So it
hmm.
like unfolds itself out of the ground. It's kind of cool.
That's so cool.
Anyway, so you can start them inside in January and they grow up these little seedlings. And then after they're probably 3 inches tall, then you can transplant them. You can also wait till they're bigger. That's
Okay.
fine too. Um, Probably around mid-March, end of March, something like that, you can transplant them outdoors.
Cool.
So they're really winter hardy, really cold, not sensitive, you know.
Yeah.
So also sometimes I direct seed into the garden because I'm lazy and I
Sure.
don't like starting them indoors and then transferring them outdoors. I feel like that's like too much effort. So sometimes I'll just direct seed. I'll plant a whole bunch of seeds, and once they're up and growing, then I'll thin
Okay.
down, kind of like we talked about in the carrot video, just pull out some. So I'm
Right.
only left with one
Right.
every 3 or 4 inches, something like that.
Okay.
And then I'll take those thinnings, if they still have the roots attached, and I'll just replant them and space those ones out. So that's another way that you can
Cool.
transplant without having to do the whole
Growing indoor.
indoor,
Yeah.
outdoor thing. So
Cool.
yeah. And then
That's
really once they're like settled and like growing well, they transplant beautifully. They really don't have many issues with transplanting at all. Just keep them watered after you transplant them for a couple of days and they'll do just fine. Really, that's
cool.
all you have to do. And then you just wait. Eventually they'll turn into bulbs and they like push out of the ground
Yeah.
and they get like, you'll see them.
Yes.
You'll see the bulbs
Pops.
coming out of the ground. And that's, and like Jackie said, when those green tops start tipping over, then you can pull them out.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's so fun.
That's really all there is to it.
I always like to touch base on this just because this is such a cool part of my learning experience, right? Like, I mean, I remember when I harvested these onions, I called you and I was like, Laura, what, I know I'm supposed to do something with them. What do I do? Because this is the first time. So it's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing with this, right? So,
Right.
again, like the harvesting, the curing, the drying, like just talk quickly about that.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of people don't know about that part because when you buy onions at the grocery store, they are already cured
Right.
and they're ready to store at that point. So curing just means that we're going to let them dry out a little bit so that they don't mold in storage.
Right.
So all that means is you just pulled them out of the ground. They're still a little bit damp. They have lots of roots attached to them, and the tops where the green stems come out is thick. and like really juicy still.
Yeah.
So all that means is you're going to let them dry for a week or two in a place where they get a lot of airflow. And you'll see that that top get smaller and smaller and get like kind of like, this is going to sound weird, but like kind of like an umbilical
I was
cord
going
that
to say
dries
an
out,
umbilical cord.
right?
Yeah.
And like shrivels, and then
Okay.
it creates like it heals, like a wound, and it heals off.
Okay.
So once that happens, then you can like pull off the tops, and or they'll fall off naturally, something like that. You can
Cool.
take off some of the paper, like trim off the roots, and then they're ready to store. Some
Mm.
onions are really good storage varieties.
Mm.
They're designed to be stored for long periods of time. Others are sweet onions, and those don't store as well at all. So you're gonna want to eat those in a month or two because they'll get
Okay.
mushy really fast.
Okay. I have heard that. Yeah, I have heard that. So I guess just be conscious of what type of onion that you're
Mhm.
growing and eat it
Right,
appropriately within the time
right.
frame.
And then, like Jackie said, onions are what's called a biennial. So they
Mm.
grow their seed in their second year. So if you wanted to save seed from onions, you would either overwinter them directly in the garden. I usually just throw some straw on top of
Okay.
whatever I'm going to save over winter for the following year. The next year they'll grow up a seed stalk, and then they grow like a really big umbel. It kind of looks like a Dr. Seuss kind of looking plant, right? So
Yes, it does.
big ball of onion at the top, and bees love it. They need to pollinate really well.
Cool.
So yeah, they'll grow seed in the second year.
Okay.
They also cross-pollinate readily with all other onions. So be prepared for that. You only need to grow one variety at a time if you want it to be a pure seed. I did want to talk for just a second about some of these alternative
Yeah.
varieties of onions that I have.
Tell us what you have.
So
Like,
the ones that most people are familiar with are just a bulbing onion,
okay.
as we talked about. But there's two other types that I do grow that are a different type. So there's one that's called a potato onion or a multiplier onion,
Okay.
which is pretty much what it sounds like. It's an onion. So most onions, they grow from one seed, they'll grow one bulb.
Okay.
These ones, once you plant the seed, that bulb is going to propagate a lot more like garlic. That is going to bulb over the next couple of years into more onions, like kind of at the ground level.
Cool. So that's kind of like what a potato does.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
Right. So that's a unique way that an onion does that. So that's some people use those. They're a little tricky to find. They're pretty rare, but some people like them because then you can have like this harvest, and you don't have to replant every year.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be more like I don't know what the word I'm looking for, but like a little more self-sustaining variety
Okay.
of onion, a little less work.
Oh, okay. Okay. A little less intense, maybe. Like,
Yeah.
anyway, I don't know.
So you could look for those multiplier onions, or they're also called potato onions.
Cool.
I don't have a lot of those, but I do grow a few of them. And then the one that I do grow a lot of is called Egyptian walking onions. And these are fun. I mostly eat them as a green onion, but you could also eat the tops or the roots.
Okay.
But they're an onion that grows a little bulb, and then it grows a big green onion, and then at the top they're going to grow. I call them bulblets, and they're like a whole bunch of little round onions, and they grow up at the top. And then what happens is at the end of the season, those get really heavy and they tip over and they fall. And so over time, it looks like they're kind of walking around your garden because they move. They like fall over and they replant themselves, and then they'll like grow new ones, and then they'll like replant themselves. So they just keep like shifting.
Yeah.
They're not invasive. You can certainly pull them out, but they're just a really fascinating plant to me. Again, like they look cool. They're like, and it's like a constant source of onions that I don't have to plant myself.
Yeah.
So I like to grow those two other types that are also, anyway, just
That's
you could
so
look at those
fun.
if you're interested in something a little bit unique. And
I love that. I can only imagine how much fun probably a walking onion would be for children, right? As they're
right,
like, like, because kids are just full of like that childlike wonder, and they're like, how are the onions moving?
right.
I think that would be a fun little science experiment for them,
Uh-huh. Yeah,
as well
and
as
again,
adults.
it's a really cool way to have like a constant source of food
Yes.
that oh yeah, perennial. That's the word I was looking for. I'm like, what's the word for like it grows back year after year and you don't have to do anything? Perennial onions. So both of those are perennial types
Cool.
rather than an annual, or onions are really biennial.
Okay.
Every other year they produce seed. So yeah, so I usually have those walking onions in my Etsy shop, and I'll put a link to those down below. Um, those are I have them pretty much from midsummer to into the winter time. So you can check my Etsy shop if you're looking for Egyptian walking onions.
That's so cool. What a cool thing, right? Like, just to recap, like, I've learned so many neat things about onions that onions are a simpler one to grow. Like,
Right,
they transplant really well. Some cool little nuances, right? Of like, you can
right.
plant them inside, transplant them outside, and yet you can just grow them straight in the garden and then
Mhm.
thin them out, transplant them. Like, that's a really sustainable way of doing that. Laura has some really cool more rare varieties out there that help you to meet your self-sufficiency goals. And also that they overwinter really well. So you can be growing onions all year long if you really want to,
Mhm.
which is a really, really cool thing to know. Like, I mean, I eat a lot of onions, to be honest. Like, I haven't figured out how to be self-sufficient with onions yet, but if I was, with how many onions I use and eat on a regular basis, I'd probably need to grow a lot of onions, but that's really neat that, and we haven't talked about like succession planting because this isn't like all the details about gardening and planting and a whole year's supply of food, right? But like, if you're thinking about that, like, as you know that onions can grow all year long, like you can kind of create we call it succession planting, but it's where you plant on one day and then like 2 weeks later or 4 weeks later or a month or 2 months later, right? You plant the next wave and you just keep planting new waves so that, if you do it every 2 months that you're planting, that by the time that the first round is fully ready to harvest, and you may have eat those ones and then the next round is ready to harvest and so on and so forth throughout
Right,
the year. That's a really cool way to create like a really nice system for your family. So
right. Yeah, and those the the great thing about onions is that they don't take a lot of space.
yeah,
So you can grow a whole bunch of onions in quite a small space.
that's awesome.
So you could you could grow them every 3 inches and they would still bulb out just fine. So that's really cool. I think if you space them a little bit further apart, they'll make bigger bulbs. So that
Okay.
might be something to keep in mind too. But you're right, like succession planting is another way to extend your harvest.
Right.
Sometimes the um the ones that you're thinning can also be planted succession.
Oh, that's
So
cool.
that's another way to do a succession planting without having to plant more seeds.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a really nice plant because you can use them medicinally. A lot of people make fire cider or onion honey combinations, right? Things like that. So, and
Yep.
then we could talk about that in a later video, but they're really supposed to be really good for your body as long as you can handle them. I know I learned about FODMAPs just recently. FODMAP is what it's called, and it's a certain some people need to eat that way, and onions are one of the things on the FODMAP diet that you shouldn't eat for if you have that going on. And I suspect that might be what my situation is, where my body just doesn't digest them well, and it
Right.
kind of ferments rather than digests. So
Right.
but if you can eat onions, like they're really supportive to the immune system and all that kind of stuff too. So
I think that they're a prebiotic as well.
yeah, I think you're right.
They feed all the good bacteria
Mhm.
before you have to feed the good bacteria.
Right.
That's my quick analysis of prebiotics. My quick summary of them. Anyway, yeah, super great food to eat. Obviously, if you can handle it, but
Yeah. And I wonder, like, how many onions do you eat in a week?
me,
Uh-huh.
I mean, because I primarily cook mostly everything from home. Like we rarely eat out, and if we eat out, it's mostly because I'm exhausted or like whatever, and it's just the convenience factor.
I
But
just wonder how many onions you need to plant
right,
yourself.
right.
How
But
much
I was
you need.
putting that caveat in there just because like I cook way more at home than I think that probably the average human does, and I make everything from scratch. So
Sure.
with that in mind, like I mean, I probably go through, and again, this is like grocery store onions because that's really all that I've had access to. But I can buy like a 3-pound bag of onions at the store. I mean, they're not huge onions; they're like smaller onions, but I easily can go through one of those every 2 weeks.
Okay.
So, I mean, I go through like probably 3 or 4 onions usually in a week.
Okay. Yeah, and really, I think like we talked about in the garlic video, you could like plan out, say if my
Yeah,
family needs 4 onions a week, then you'd multiply that by 50.
right.
And let's see,
It's 200 onions.
200 onions. And then if you have a row and you can plant 4 across,
Right.
you need 50 rows.
Okay. That's not
50,
terrible.
yeah. And so you're probably going to grow 200 onions in about 30 feet of row.
Well,
So,
then
I mean, really,
for a year.
it wouldn't take that much space for you to grow an
Right.
entire year's supply of onions
Right.
at the level that Jackie eats them at, right? So,
Right. Just like I said, more intense than probably the average human.
yeah. So if you only use 2 onions a week, then you could cut that in half and grow it in like 15 or 20 feet
Right.
space. And 4 feet by 15 feet is not that much room.
It's really not.
In my garden, it's probably half a row,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. So that might give you kind of a visual of what you might be looking at of growing a year's supply of onions.
Cool.
Kind of, and again, you can like space that out with like green onions during the winter time, and some of these perennial onions that you might want to try out and things like that too. So
Right.
anyway,
Right. What a cool discussion. Like so
yeah.
many varieties out there and things to try. So
Mhm.
like always, we'd love to hear about your experiences with onions, whether if it's just, oh, I buy green onions at the store and use them. Or
Right.
if you have chosen to plant anything, or if you have any experience with some rare varieties or anything like that, we'd love to hear about your experience. So feel free to comment below or come join us in our Facebook group. We'd love to have you join our community there. We're having lots of fun discussions about food and self-sufficiency and all sorts of cool topics there. So
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, and I just wanted to end with when you grow onions from seed, it's really fun because there's a lot of color variations and shape variations, and there's ones that like grow long torpedo shapes and ones that are like flat and skinny and things like that. There's deep colored ones. There's all sorts of different shapes and sizes. So that's really fun to try different types. So.
that is so fun. I love it.
Oh, I did want to mention too, onion seed is one of those things that don't last very long. So they only last in storage, the seeds, for like 1 to 2 years. So you want to keep that in mind if you're storing onion seed. You need to buy fresh seed pretty much every year. Maybe every year. So keep that in mind if you're looking for onion seeds.
Cool. That's a really good point to be aware of.
Yeah.
Very
All
good.
right. Yeah, come join us in the Facebook group. We'd love to hear about your onion stories too. So, all right. Talk to you later.
Sounds good. See you guys. Bye.
Bye.